Thank you. My name is Kim Martin. I'm the principal at Wilson High School. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So at Wilson High School, for the last few years, we've been embarking on a discussion of race and social justice. So for the staff and the students at Wilson High School, this is not a new conversation. And I know that many of you are here this evening because you want to talk about whether the name of the high school should be changed or not. And you may have opinions on that topic. For me, the conversation is only sort of about the name of the high school. It really is a conversation about racial justice. It's a conversation about the experiences that students of color have when they enter our school, or when they're working in Northwest neighborhoods, or when they are interacting with their peers. For me, it's a conversation about what it means to be a Wilson Tiger, and what it means to be a student of color, and what it means to be an out-of-boundary student, or many of the labels and the titles that we ascribe to kids. And a lot of that, of course, is connected to racial justice, and connected to economics, and connected to racism. In fact, I would say almost a lot of it is connected to racism. And that is where we enter the stage, for me, into the conversation about the name of the high school. These conversations can be tense. They can cause a lot of emotion. I've seen people cry. I've seen people get angry. I've seen people feel guilt. I've seen people feel anxiety. I suspect that you might feel any one of those range of emotions today. So I would ask you to just consider what it might be to be a child and to feel all of those things, or to hear those things, or to realize those things, and to know those things. And perhaps to open your heart and be a little sympathetic about what that experience might be. That's the place where I want you to enter the conversation about the name of the high school. Whether it stays the same, whether it changes, that's an important topic, but let's set that aside to really talk about the kind of school that we want to be and what the experience is for kids who attend here. That's where I come into the conversation. Can we agree on that?
Right.
All right. Having set the stage for that, now we're going to talk about the name of the high school. I would like to introduce Tim and Tanya, who are going to tell you a little bit more about how the evening is going to go. Thank you for your time, and again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Principal Martin, and thank you to the amazing staff and teachers of Woodrow Wilson High School. We're so fortunate to be here and to have this conversation. This is my friend Tanya Hardy, and Tanya is working with our collective and with James Fisher, who's up on the stage. James is the descendant of the Broad Branch Road community, and Tanya and James and I have been working to make sure that that history is acknowledged and marked, and so please stay tuned on the Lafayette picture. But what Tanya and I are going to do is just a quick little setup piece with some slides, and then we're going to hand it off to our amazing panel and to Ray Suarez. So, Woodrow Wilson, idealist, progressive, statesman, scholar, intellectual, two-term president, father of the League of Nations, Nobel Peace Prize laureate. This is the leader our school was named after when it was established in 1935, 11 years after Wilson died.
Yet residents of Washington, especially Black Washingtonians, knew a different side of Woodrow Wilson. Washington had become a mecca of opportunity for Blacks who moved here after the Civil War to escape racial violence and to take advantage of the city's unique educational and employment opportunities. DC was home to the renowned M Street School, now Dunbar High School, and Howard University, and it provided well-paying, stable jobs in the federal government.
That upward mobility was vastly diminished under President Wilson, who turned the clock back on Black achievement and Black aspirations. Within months of taking office in 1913, Wilson oversaw the firing and demotions of Black federal workers. His administration segregated the federal civil service so that no white worker would have to answer to a Black supervisor. So to the qualities of statesman and scholar, we have to add racist and segregationist. This too is Woodrow Wilson.
And we have to face just how this school came to be built here in this very place. During the decade after the Wilson administration, in the 1920s, leaders of local government and private land developers institutionalized segregation and relentlessly pursued racial exclusion in Washington. Just across the street from Wilson High School is the site of a one-time thriving community of over 300 mostly black families. Reno City was razed and its residents were forced out in the 1920s and 30s as white families were welcomed to the neighborhood with the promise of new, racially exclusive schools and parks.
We hope tonight's discussion will help us come to grips with our history and decide how to move forward. On behalf of the DC History and Justice Collective and the Wilson Diversity Task Force, thank you, Principal Martin, for helping us bring this discussion to our community. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed moderator and parent of Wilson High School graduate, Ray Suarez.
Well, as the father of a Wilson graduate, I've spent a lot of time in this room sitting exactly where you're sitting, watching plays, talking about how to fill out FAFSA. It is a time of both remarkable change and breathtaking pace for that change. Across the country, residence halls on college campuses, memorials in public parks, even mountains are being renamed as 21st century America reckons with a complex history. What honors, tributes, even history itself mean to a country, to a state, to a neighborhood? Are these designations, these tributes, these dedications meant to last forever? Are they once and for all? Do they crystallize an attitude at a specific time, in a specific place? Or are they open to be revisited, renegotiated, reconsidered? Complicating the story, as you just heard moments ago, the history of this neighborhood that stood where we now sit. An African-American neighborhood swept away, erased from Upper Northwest to build public works projects during the Great Depression. We'll talk more about that in just a little while. Over their lives and long after their deaths, public figures change in the public's estimation. The 28th president was no exception, and among all Americans, presidents are particularly open to this kind of reconsideration. Toward the end of his life, Woodrow Wilson lived here in the District of Columbia. He did not retire and return to some other place to spend the final years of his life. His house is open to visitors, maintained by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And if you haven't been there yet for a visit, after this night's discussion, I definitely recommend that you head over there. Woodrow Wilson's tomb is on the south side of the nave at Washington National Cathedral. So Thomas Woodrow Wilson is spending eternity with us here in DC, whether you like it or not. As it happens, President Wilson's tomb sits just a few feet away from two niches, which had also been tributes, gifts from the Daughters of the American Confederacy, United Daughters of the Confederacy, to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Those windows and carved memorials have been removed and are now being installed elsewhere in the cathedral complex in a space being designed for their permanent installation. But this high school is different. It's a binary function. A high school is either named for somebody or it's not. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Our first panelists for kickoff for tonight's series of conversations will deal with the history, the Woodrow Wilson legacy. And they are Eric Yellen of the University of Richmond and John Milton Cooper, Professor Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a member of the Woodrow Wilson High School class of 1957. Professor Yellen, please begin.
I think I'm going to start with what I'm thinking of as three stipulations, three just claims, and then we can play with them or you can pass on them. The first stipulation or claim is that I think that public schools are expressions of community. They are the result of a community's effort to invest in its families, its children, and ultimately its future. As such, they should reflect the community's identities and its aspirations. It's a tough job, it's a complex job. But a school's name is certainly one place where this imperative can matter. And so I think it's a fair question to ask about whether the school's name reflects the community and its aspirations. A community certainly has the right to declare that a school's name no longer reflects its identities or its aspirations. My role here, as someone who's not a member of this community, is to be the historian, to supply what I understand to be facts. I'm not a member of this community, and so it's not really up to me what this community should call its school. I want to stipulate that. So I'll just state some facts. With Woodrow Wilson's permission, and with rationalization and justifications he provided, and those justifications were incredibly important, the Wilson administration not only segregated offices of the federal government here in DC, most of which had never been racially segregated. We sometimes hear that the offices were resegregated under Wilson. That's a misstatement. They were never segregated officially. It also, more than segregation, it also erected a ceiling over the career progress of Black Washingtonians that was so firm, so carefully managed, that an almost steel bond would form between blackness and economic disadvantage in Washington and beyond. Put another way, the Wilson administration didn't just separate out black people. It sought to condemn them to a life in which ability and hard work would never yield the kind of security or success American life was supposed to guarantee. Because the federal government was then, as it is today, the most important employer of African Americans in the nation, this destruction of black government work had particular impact on this city, but also mattered in ways that stretched far beyond Washington, D.C. My last stipulation or fact. Regarding Woodrow Wilson himself, it must be said that Woodrow Wilson was a white supremacist. While not nearly as violent in person or rhetoric as others in his day, Wilson clearly believed that black people were less valuable as people and as citizens than white people. He believed that African Americans had been retarded by history and that they were, on the whole, backward and ineligible for the awesome responsibilities of democracy and full citizenship. He allowed hate and bigotry against black people to flourish in his administration. He believed racial segregation was not only acceptable, but he said preferable. These facts, I think, must be considered alongside any citations of Wilson's considerable positive accomplishments. The Federal Reserve System, from my work, the 8-hour workday, the antitrust legislation, certainly the winning of World War I, and the creation of a peace settlement. But these harder truths must be set aside or set with these accomplishments. First, because they really mattered and truly harmed many, many Americans. And second, because they were not simply disconnected from those positive accomplishments. I think it's true that the case against Wilson is not as cut and dried as some others, say Stonewall Jackson in the city where I live in Richmond, Virginia. To me, Jackson's primary act in American life was to fight for the enslavement of other human beings. It's easy to see why children shouldn't be educated in a building named after him. Wilson's accomplishments, however, were multiple and occupy a broader spectrum of admirability by the standards of his own day and our own. Still, I would argue that nearly all of Wilson's actions as president were premised on a vision of world progress that excluded black people. Thank you.
The bad certainly is race. I think civil liberties also during World War I is bad with him. Something that, as a biographer, I've wrestled with and frankly still have not come up with a terribly good answer. On race, Eric put it rightly when he said he's not as bad as a lot of others there. We can think of some of those terrible demagogues of that era, Tom Watson, James K. Vardaman, Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Wilson, I think his Southern birth and background is misleading. He had no deep roots in the South. In fact, he had no deep roots in the United States. He's one of 7 or 8 presidents who had a foreign-born parent, and one of only 2 presidents who had no American-born grandparents. So his roots in this country and in the South, his parents had moved to Virginia from Ohio just a few years before he was born. And to some extent, his upbringing in the Presbyterian clergy insulated him a bit from his surrounding environment. Interestingly, when he got to college, his schoolmates were amazed he didn't have a Southern accent. And he was a reconstructed Southerner, too. In law school, he publicly celebrated the defeat of the Confederacy and the demise of slavery. He did make some gestures which are really racially enlightened. When he was inaugurated president of Princeton, he invited Booker T. Washington, which scandalized his Southern in-laws. And he said he thought Washington gave the best speech at the inaugural ceremonies. And his daughter said, "Even better than your speech, Father?" And he condemned lynching. He was the first president ever to condemn lynching. On his record with his administration of race, I would say nothing to try to defend it. The only thing I would say is I do think we need to put it into context. The segregation in the federal workforce did not begin with Woodrow Wilson. It had begun informally under Theodore Roosevelt and continued under William Howard Taft. Interestingly, when the Republicans came back into power in the 1920s, they did not reverse the policies or expand employment again for African Americans. So what we've got here is a problem of white America generally. Wilson really was a white northerner at his time. And what that meant was, as opposed to the Southerners, he wasn't obsessed with race. He was, most white northerners, with some significant and notable exceptions, were pretty much blind to racial injustice and thought of race as a secondary, lesser problem, a Southern problem, something that black self-help, a la Booker T. Washington, would take care of. And Wilson's pretty much in that. His segregation policies were things that he, as Eric said, oversaw. He did not initiate them himself. It was his cabinet secretary, Southern ones, that wanted to do it. He was very concerned, as we would say, about his base, his Southern base, so he permitted it. Protests did put the brakes on the formal segregation, although it continued, and as Eric said, the downgrading of black federal employees continued. There's all of that. You can't blink it away. You just simply cannot blink that away. But again, how do we judge it? Do we judge the Federal Reserve, the League of Nations, Brandeis to the Supreme Court, child labor law, aid to farmers, 8-hour day for workers, World War I, the 14 points, the League of Nations? How do we balance it? It is a matter of judgment. The other thing, though, Eric talked about, and something I want to talk about too, is how we name schools and what it stands for. I did a little bit of, I'm embarrassed to say, Wikipedia research, just to see how naming of schools has come about and changed in Washington, D.C., of high schools. There have been some name changes, but interestingly enough, they were name changes to add a person's name, not to take it away. Cardozo used to be Central High School. Duke Ellington used to be Western High School. I mean, just generic geographic things and appropriately honoring somebody. So that's been what we've done. Now, we have 3 high schools in Washington named after presidents: Roosevelt, Coolidge, and Wilson. Roosevelt is Theodore, not Franklin Roosevelt. That was opened in 1920, just a year after he was born, after he died. And I think that was a no-brainer. The Republicans were in control of Congress then, and the DC government, so that was fine. Wilson was the second one, 1935. And okay, I don't know how that came about. Probably you balanced a Republican with a Democrat. It was a bit of a bold move then, though, because Wilson's reputation in 1935 was also down in the gutter. Not because of race, but because of buyer's remorse over World War I. World War I in the 1930s actually came to be more strongly repudiated than Vietnam or Iraq. So that was a certain niceness about that. Coolidge was the third one. That was opened in 1937, and interestingly, they did a vote in the neighborhood, and they chose Calvin Coolidge. Now, must have been a lot of Republicans living there. But what's in a name? Shakespeare again.
Please begin to wrap.
I just want to get a little bit about this in, Ray, and I'm done. What does Woodrow Wilson stand for, the name? It stands for academic excellence. In the mid-1950s, Harvard did a hush-hush confidential study of high schools, of schools, secondary schools, that had produced an inordinate number of honors graduates. The list was interesting. It was 20 schools, all public schools, no private schools, all from the Middle Atlantic, not Boston Latin, not New Trier. 18 of the 20 were in and around New York City. Stuyvesant, Bronx Science, usual suspects. The other two were Central High in Philadelphia and Woodrow Wilson High School in Washington, D.C. Now, what they had in common was a very large number of Jewish students. You know, this was Harvard was embarrassed about this, as most of the Ivy League was. But Wilson produced, this was a really extraordinary place. I've often said, admitted, that with a subsequent career going to Ivy League colleges, teaching at Wellesley in Wisconsin, the fastest intellectual company I was ever in was in high school. I had no problem about being the smartest kid in the class. I knew from a very early time that I was not. And then going on to Princeton was, yeah, okay, you know, I wasn't dethroned. I hadn't been the academic top dog. Wilson was synonymous with academic excellence, which I think is very appropriate because he's our only professional educator, only PhD who was ever president. And what he stood for as president of Princeton was, again, academic excellence. He took that sleepy, snobbish men's college and began to make it into a first-rate university, the kind of place that both Eric and I went to and were very, very happy to go to. So that's been the association. As Eric also said, Wilson stayed here. He's the only president, except Barack Obama thus far, who remained in Washington. He's buried here too, the only president buried in DC. But I think that association of academic excellence, if I wanted to see a name change here, I'd like to see a name added. I think it's a little early for it, but I'd like to see it sometime. I'd like to see Barack Obama's name added. Because those two men, Obama is the most intellectual president we've had since Wilson. And again, I think he stands for the life of the mind. And that's what Wilson stood for. Thank you.
Professor Yellen, let me give you an opportunity for a brief reply to what you heard from your colleague. And also maybe throw a little more into the mix there. If we assessed the public figures from 1875 to 1925 before we put their names on schools, a much smaller number of people would pass muster, isn't that the case? By the lights of 2019?
So there's two questions in there. One is, how do I respond to John, which is hard because he's John. And then the other question is, how do we hold this what's our standard? And I've been asked this a lot. Am I holding Wilson to a standard of today rather than of his own time? And my answer is, if you read my book, that actually I'm not holding him to any standard. I'm telling a story. And in his own time, there were other standards. And so my response to John is, in some ways, is similar to my response to the question of the standards. John gives us an image of Wilson before the world, begging for peace and democracy, which I think is real. The image I go to is the image of Woodrow Wilson in his office facing William Monroe Trotter, a Harvard graduate, a brilliant civil rights leader, who tried to get through to Wilson, who made an articulate claim about what segregation and the attenuating of careers meant to black people, not just in Washington, D.C., but in the country as a whole. And it was Wilson's incapacity to hear, Wilson's incapacity to recognize Trotter's case And frankly, if you read the transcript, Trotter as an equal, as a human being. That's where I sort of run short on this image of a man standing for democracy and peace. This was somebody who was deeply threatened by someone like William Monroe Trotter, who was his intellectual equal. And that's not academic excellence, that's fear and vulnerability. Right? And so I think that image has to sit alongside these other absolutely accurate ones.
On to our next panel, looking at the history of this area where Woodrow Wilson High School sits. The panel includes Alcione Amos, Curator of the Smithsonian Institution and its Anacostia Community Museum, Neil Flanagan of the City Paper and author of the 2017 article, The Battle of Fort Reno, and James Fisher, native Washingtonian, retired civil servant, and descendant of people who lived in and worked in the communities of color here in Upper Northwest that were swept away by this redevelopment. Alcione Amos, kick us off.
My interest in Reno and its history came from my work as a curator of the exhibit, How the Civil War Changed Washington. This exhibit was displayed at the Smithsonian Institution Anacostia Community Museum as part of the celebration of the 150 years of the Civil War in 2015. I was looking at forts that surrounded Washington during the Civil War and wanted to know how they had affected or changed the city. My research found that these forts had an influence in expanding the footprint of the city. When I came across Fort Reno, I became fascinated by it, and its history became part of the exhibit. After the Civil War, I'm going to give just a little bit of the history. I'm sure that you were going to give more. Okay, I'm going to do the happy part. It's going to be the sad part. After the Civil War, a real estate development company with the comical and strange name of Onion and Butts subdivided the area which had been occupied by the fort and advertised for elegant building lots. Now, I must tell you that I had quite an experience, an unfortunate experience, searching Onion and Butts in Google. I came up with all sorts of pornographic sites, not any information about the company in itself, but anyway. The human dimension of the history of Reno City was told in the exhibits through the histories of two families, the Dovers at Denison Place and the Bangarters at Davenport Street. The Bangarters were white, the Dovers were African American. They lived a block from each other. To me, that was one of the aspects of Reno City that was unique. Although I'm sure African Americans and whites did not quite socialize with each other, they definitely did not frequent the same churches and the same schools. They had to come across each other on the streets of the neighborhood and had to be aware of each other as neighbors. And this was very unusual at the time. Now the history of these two couples. Ariana and George Dover were enslaved in Washington, D.C. Ariana was a mother of 4 children, and they were enslaved by Louis Kengler, a successful Georgetown merchant who claimed compensation for her and her children under the District of Columbia Emancipation Act. Ariana and her children would have to live in Kengler's house in Georgetown. Now, George Dover was enslaved by Pierce Shoemaker, who also claimed compensation for him under the Emancipation Act. He would have to live on the property of his owner in the area which is today Rock Creek Park. Pierce Shoemaker was the owner of Pierce Mill. For the Dovers, buying property at Reno City after emancipation and building a house where the family could live together was an opportunity to establish a normal family life. Swiss immigrant Frederick Bangarter came to the United States in 1864. He married a German immigrant, and 5 years after arriving in Washington, and almost 1 year after his marriage, Bangarter bought a house and 2 lots in Reno. Bangarter's descendants believe he bought the quartermaster's house, still standing after the abandonment of the fort. Bangarter built a successful dairy business, which he named Swiss Dairy, a nod to his motherland. He was a farmer in Switzerland, and buying land in Reno gave him the opportunity to start a successful business. The family owned property in Reno City well into the 20th century. They were not happy over the decades to have their property taken by eminent domain. So Reno City, right after the Civil War, was a place of hope and new beginnings before it was destroyed to become a park. I hope this information added some knowledge of Reno City to your baggage of knowledge, and thank you very much for your attention.
To start with is to move past the rural period of Reno and to look at what Reno was like when Woodrow Wilson took office in 1913. Far from, and this is an element of the piece that I wrote that I feel like maybe I was not able to express as well, which is that far from being a sort of town, it was well on its way of no longer being Reno City, but becoming the neighborhood of Reno. And increasingly, its lots were filled in. It was the houses were getting nicer, not just the original sort of self-built houses and rural businesses, but people were starting to erect nicer houses, including African Americans who were commuting into the city. And I think that's important to understand that it was really thriving at that point. And there's sort of movement to, there's always a tension between them and the communities. As far back as 1899, we see sort of calls for some kind of cleaning up of Reno from the white community around it. But it's not really until the 1920s then that there starts to become more of agitation that to remove the community. And when we see that happening, what's actually going on is there's a significant back end that has been relatively hard to track. But in a sort of a letter that I was able to locate from 1923 by the real estate developer Harold Doyle, he says, at about 10 years ago, I with a few other locals began buying up property in Reno with the plan to eventually redevelop the area. And he says this to the District Columbia Commissioners, the government at the time. And you have to kind of wonder what was going on in 1913 that he decided to start making this decision. And I think perhaps it's not an actual causation, but maybe more of a sense. Because that's really when Reno stops growing. The number of real estate transactions drops dramatically. A lot of the ones that do happen, he is leading. And so from then, you also start to see the interests of the government, where in 1914, the District of Columbia surveyor, Melvin Hazen, presents for the first time a plan to use eminent domain on the land to condemn the old city, the street grid laid out by onion butts, and to replace it with a more modern one. So there's a significant amount of activity that happens there, and then nothing really seems to sort of happen again until the 1920s. And that may just, I'm not sure what that means, but you generally sort of see a pattern emerging that there's something changes in 1913. And that goes on to the story that's more familiar with the progress through different government agencies, eventually hitting Congress in 1926 with a bill to condemn Reno. And then by 1927, really it's a bureaucratic parlor game. And from 1926 on until basically 1938, there's kind of this tension of how much of Reno will they take. And then in 1938, there's a conclusive sort of push to condemn all the rest of the remaining community, which is still at that point probably 10 or 15 houses, which is completed by the early 1950s. And what's striking reading letters from the 1938 is just how much more open the authors are than they are in, say, 1920 or 1910 about their hostility to this community. That Harold Doyle in 1920 doesn't use the word African American, but he does in 1930, or he uses Negro in 1938, but he can't actually say that in 1920. And when you look again, there is something that changed in DC in 1914, where that would even be considered, because in the 1910s, or the early 1900s, the community around it that's complaining, they're primarily complaining about the sanitation or the health of the area. So there is, if not a literal connection between Wilson, I think there is a cultural connection where the culture changes around that time in DC because the federal government is leading it. And I think to the point of whether Woodrow Wilson is someone that is someone worth memorializing, one thing that comes again and again in real estate, right, is locations. Like, is this the right location to memorialize Woodrow Wilson? Or is there another location? Is the ground somehow tainted here in particular that maybe might not be in other locations?
I was born and raised in DC with 3 sisters by a very loving, hardworking mother. She had 10 siblings, and I noticed that the family was never close. We were extremely disconnected, and I didn't understand why. Learning about my family's history helped me to understand. A huge discovery was that I had a 5th great-grandfather, Captain George Pointer, who was born a slave but bought his freedom while working for George Washington's Potomac Canal Company. And he rose to become the only black superintendent of the company. The entire world should have the opportunity to be inspired by this man's amazing story. His influence over his family promoted their success as providers for themselves and generations to come. In the 1850s, his granddaughter, Mary Ann Plummer Harris, and her husband purchased 2 acres of farmland on Broad Brass Road in what is now considered Lafayette Park. The farm was much more than a bare land. It was a family village where they raised 8 children and provided a safe, loving haven for multiple generations of family. In the early 1900s, 2 family members relocated their families to Fort Reno and Tinsleytown areas and stayed connected to the family village. In 1928, the Broad Branch family village was taken. A few years later, the families in Tinsleytown and Reno became homeless as well. This was not just a taking of land, but a destruction of my family and long-held black communities in the area. The Broad Branch village was essential to maintaining the family bond that had flourished for nearly 80 years. My family was scattered to unfamiliar areas in Washington, D.C. and never recovered. Thank you.
Flanagan, a question before we move on to our next panel. Was there a consciousness that Upper Northwest, that these parts of the Third Ward were becoming almost entirely white? Was that an intention in a segregated city? Was it understood that this was part of the overall approach toward what the city was going to look like later in the 20th century?
Which means all white?
Yeah, Neil and James, sure.
You know,
Excuse me.
yes, there was, and maybe not all white in a sense, again, because they started to be able to say that by the 30s, but in the 20s, from the ads I've read, not so much. But the important thing to understand is that the real estate theory at the time was basically wealthy people built their nice houses, middle class people start to move in as the wealthy get bored, apartment houses are built, then black people move in, the industry moves in. And that was known as infiltration theory, and it was seen as a sort of law of nature. And that is why, that's why Chevy Chase was built so far out there. It was basically to give it more time. Chevy Chase, Maryland was built way before everything in between it and DuPont Circle. And they referred to, and so assume that that means the real estate values are continually dropping, they would refer to the area between sort of Rock Creek Park and Massachusetts Avenue as the triangle of increasing value. So that was the vision that they had for it.
James Fisher, was there a consciousness that black people were purposely being moved out, that as people in authority looked at the land, they chose areas of black settlement to move people out and create these new developments?
Yes, blacks were the most vulnerable, and through my research, one writer wrote that in the Fort Reno area, and Chevy Chase Land Company decided to build homes there, and one way to keep African Americans out, plus people of the Jewish persuasion, was to price the houses above their means.
Our final panel will bring us the Wilson community, faculty and students. We'll hear from Clarence Alston, who teaches world history, a Southerner by birth, a Washingtonian by choice, and Michele Bollinger, who now teaches DC history, AP US history, and women's history here at Woodrow Wilson High School. Ayomi Wolff from the class of 2020, Nikki Keating from the class of 2021, who are both members of the Diversity Task Force. Clarence Alston?
As a history teacher, I have a couple of takeaways when I think about Thomas Wilson. While he served as the leader of the executive branch, he failed to guard the individual rights and protections of all Americans, i.e. African Americans, and therefore jeopardizes the legacy of his presidency. Secondly, he displayed a high level of moral cowardice by allowing segregation to permeate throughout the federal government, which gave validation to other parts of the country to do the same. During his first term, for example, a law was passed which made racial intermarriage a felony in the district. Time and time again, he abdicated his responsibility as the moral leader of the country. Third, he was a living contradiction, as evidenced by his statement, quote, "The interest of the weakest is as important as the interest of the strongest." Yet his justification for segregation was to avoid friction between whites and blacks. Additionally, his noble ideals of ethnic self-determination for Bosnians, Austrians, and Poles did not translate into African Americans having freedom to realize their determination guaranteed by the Constitution. Finally, therefore, I think it is important that we must hold those persons accountable who are perpetrators of racism and bigotry, or who are an accessory to its intent. We must send a clear message to this generation that a moral line of decency exists, and when it is crossed, whether in antiquity or modernity, there are consequences. Thank you.
And I vowed when I became an educator that I might be a good educator, might be a not so good one. I would try my best and I wouldn't lie. And so I try to represent the honesty, honesty in history, even when it's not nice to look at. And so that is one guiding process for me. The second is, our librarian, Pam Gardner, who's an amazing person and a great resource, brought actually someone from the the Sumner Museum to speak on Black Family Town several years ago. It was the first I'd heard of Reno City, and I really appreciated that contribution and the scholarship that people have brought to the discussion. And then finally, I guess a few years ago, the Black Lives Matter movement, especially at Princeton University, where students there grappled with, Wilson's overwhelming presence on their campus, raised critiques, not just of Wilson himself, but the implications of continuing to choose to honor someone whose past is so problematic. I will leave the history to the historians, but I will just add that Wilson's presidency and his, that era in Washington, D.C. was marked by just reprehensible racial dynamics. In addition to the segregation of the federal government, there was a race riot in Washington, D.C. in 1919, where African Americans were killed by white rioters. Wilson did not intervene. He did not, well, I guess eventually he sent troops in, my mistake. But it took several days for a federal response to the violence that carried on in this city in July of 1919. And I do also think when we're evaluating people, the question of standards, today's standards versus yesterday's, I just want to underscore that there were people who did challenge Wilson, as previous speakers have said. The NAACP wanted to boycott, Birth of a Nation, which Wilson's comments appear in, and that aired in the White House while he was president. There's more to say about his problematic history, but again, I'm coming at this more from an educator's perspective, less the historian's perspective, so I hope to hear more comments tonight. Just to add, I think that the main reason why I welcome the opportunity to change the name of the school or talk about changing the name of the school is that I think continuing to honor Wilson perpetuates racism, it perpetuates discrimination, it enables people to think that racism is something to be tolerated and accepted and sort of excused away. And I think that's what we do when we say he was a product of his times and those sorts of things. We could debate the extent to which it's fair to criticize him, but the fact of the matter is we know what he represents now. And we know that doesn't fit our values as Wilson High School today. We are a community it's an amazing community, and people in this school create and do amazing things every day. And as educators, we are the custodians of this space, and we want to keep its memories alive, but we also want to protect this space for the children who walk through here every day, especially students of color, African American students who grapple with the prejudice and the racism that characterizes our society. And students notice. They notice Wilson, not all the time. They might not know everything about him, but students notice when they learn about him that his presence is here, and question, why would we have our school, as diverse as it is, as proud as we are of our values, why do we have this name? And I think white students notice too, that we say racism is wrong, but then we don't do anything, or we don't do enough about it. We continue to honor the same people, and we, again, excuse away their actions. I think that actions speak louder than words, and so I think it's not enough just to criticize or debate a legacy. I think it's important to take action, especially when we know that something is wrong. Just a couple other things. I think, some of the conversations we've had here about Wilson's legacy, point out rightfully that this is a cosmetic change, maybe even a superficial one. And I want to say that I really do agree that we have far to go to build a truly equitable system in public schools, to create the kind of community that serves all students and serves them well, the kind of community that has high expectations and equips kids to meet them. But I, at the same time, think that changing the name, acknowledging the problems of the past is an important first step in that. And it would be no reason to really pat ourselves on the back and think our work is done. It would just be the beginning, I think, of a process, a discussion that actually goes on in this building every day among the educators and the administration about how to do that. And I think it would serve that purpose really well. Finally, every year in my DC history class, we do discuss other options. And it's actually really exciting because, you know, presidents are honored all the time, but our local heroes are not. This year, graffiti artist Cool Disco Dan won the class vote. But in the past, we've had the likes of Frank Kameny, one of the earliest gay rights activists in our city and in our nation's history. The great Hilda Mason, former teacher and statehood leader, won one year. Archibald Grimke won one time. He was a contemporary of Wilson's in the NAACP. Who challenged him with Monroe Trotter. And then, of course, now, due to Mr. Flanagan's work and others, we have the James Neal of Reno City. So, I don't know, there's lots of possibilities. And I think we should think about what we stand to gain from something like this and not fear what we may lose. Because this place is, I'm sorry, it's about a lot more than the people who have been here. It's about the generations that are coming through. And we, again, that's who we're oriented on. So, thank you very much.
Nikki?
Hello, everybody. I am a student at Wilson. I'm a sophomore. And when I was asked this question, I was asked to be on this panel, my first thought was, well, the students at Wilson don't identify with Woodrow Wilson. We walk through the hallways and we don't think, oh, I go to Woodrow Wilson, I go to Wilson. You know, you never, when we're out at our sports or we're out representing our school, we never go and think to ourselves, I'm representing someone with such a past or Woodrow Wilson. So, what I'm like trying to say is, sorry, bear with me, I'm under the weather, so I'm trying to pull my thoughts together. I'm trying to say that the students at Wilson stand for change and what is right and our identity. And I feel that Woodrow Wilson doesn't stand for what we believe in anymore. His past proves that in the present, that he's not what the students reflect. And I feel that we shouldn't have pictures of him on our walls. We shouldn't speak his name as a part of us. And I feel like we should move past that.
And finally, Ayomi Wolff.
Hi, I'm Ayomi Wolff. I'm a junior here at Wilson, and I know you've been hearing from professionals and educators and professors, teachers, and from my peer, Nikki. But I think it's imperative that we also hear from the students that this is the school we walk in through every day, that, you know, I'm currently taking AP US history. I've been learning about my government, about my history, about my city, about my school, about the man whose the school is named after, and I know that his history doesn't represent my history, it doesn't represent what I stand for, what I believe in, and that do I really want to come in here knowing that what I believe in is not what he believed in, and what he believed in is not what I stand for. Thank you.
It's unlikely that it would be named for Woodrow Wilson, not because there's already one here, but even if we were building a successor school to this one, just as it's, I'm guessing, I haven't taken a poll, but it's unlikely we would name it for Christopher Columbus, or that there would be a new Robert E. Lee High School somewhere in Arlington. In Nashville, it's unlikely there'll be any new parks or monuments named for Nathan Bedford Forrest, or that the legislature in Little Rock would pass a resolution honoring Orville Faubus, or the legislature in Jackson would pass a resolution honoring Theodore Bilbo. There are some people who have just had their profile in history changed by time in a way that they simply wouldn't be considered. Is that relevant to our discussions today? Is it relevant to a student in 2019, the fact that we wouldn't name this school, probably, for Woodrow Wilson today? Once you grab something like the high ground and you do something significant like naming a school for somebody, is it done with the understanding that that's a pretty durable thing? And as times and impressions change, that name is going to stick with us, not only because of who we are, but because of who we were when the school was built, when the school was dedicated. I'm curious where the panelists come down on those questions, because right now we're in this massive societal renegotiation of questions like that. Whether, you know, Jefferson Davis had very, very little to do with the history of New Orleans, but there he was, bigger than life, on an enormous monument, which has since been taken down. Is this conversation we're having about Woodrow Wilson High School part of that wider societal reconsideration of who gets honored, by who, where, and when?
I'd like to go back to something that was mentioned earlier. I think it's fair and accurate to say that we should not discount the good. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things that comes to mind when we think about Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Woodrow Wilson, is the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think he goes through this myriad of stages where, yes, he is held up in the world as a advocate for self-determination, democracy around the world, but unable to see the same struggles and the inability of African Americans to gain access to those same grandiose ideals. I think renaming the school it's clearly a discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. I want to go also back to something that my esteemed colleague, Ms. Bollinger, mentioned. But it is a cosmetic act. Changing the name without providing, especially students and those who are unaware in our community of the history, I think it's not enough. So we need to go further. I think another option that might be considered definitely more cost-effective would be to name or identify a space that already exists here in the school. The auditorium, the library, giving that the name, Reno City, or referring to those who have clearly participated in the struggle. I think there are some other ways that we can address the past as well as looking at what we need to uphold in the future.
Would you like to repeat the question?
Does the fact that we likely wouldn't name a new high school for Woodrow Wilson enter into this conversation? Is this a reflection not only of who we are, which is a lot of what people talk about in the debates of whether the name would change, but also a reminder of who we were, a time and a place, so that the naming of every monument, park, landmark, school, library isn't a part of constant renegotiation.
I'm just curious on like where the line is. Like, there's certain people that you know you don't name things after. Like you were saying yourself, like Robert E. Lee, like you wouldn't name a high school after him, but it's not in DC, and there's no, like where is that line? Does Woodrow Wilson cross that line? I think he does. I think he has a deep history in this city, in this area, not just like in Washington, like in this specific area, in Reno City, from Belt to Grant to Broad Branch. Those areas have a deep connection to him. He's buried here. I mean, and where does he draw the line? Where does he stand on that line of, is he, you know, is it iffy? Is he worth being named after? I think that he devastated this area. Not just the people who lived here, but also the government, the Washington government. I think he crosses a line and doesn't deserve the name of my beautiful high school. And I don't understand why he doesn't cross that line. Like, where does the bad outweigh the good?
But I will say that actually picking up on something John said, namings are not trans-historical acts. They occur in particular times and places for particular reasons. Robert E. Lee's statue went up in my city in 1890, not in 1865, not in 1860. Why 1890? Because it was a statement by white supremacists that this is what mattered in Richmond, this is what mattered in the South. Jeff Davis was put up in 1919. Why? Because the United States was making a stand for white supremacy in 1919. Ronald Reagan National Airport is a joke. It's a comment on one of Ronald Reagan's most infamous acts, which was to dismiss air traffic controllers. And to name the airport after him was a deliberate act of reminding us of Reagan's stand against the Air Traffic Controllers Union. These are not trans-historic acts, they happen for a reason. And so changes can happen for a reason too. If this community decides that this isn't who it is, again, I'm not worried that we'll forget about Woodrow Wilson.
Amen, brother. Yeah. As I say, I hope there will at least be some consideration of what this school has been. I've already had my say on that. It was a wonderful place then. It really was. It was not, let me be very clear about what it was and wasn't. It was not racially diverse. I mean, that is actually a bad joke. I started the fall after the Brown decision. And when I graduated 3 years later, it was only 3 years in those days, there were only 2 black students. The reason, well, I think we heard it already, was residential segregation. What they did do, though, and I mentioned this earlier to Mr. Alston, that what they did immediately after the Brown decision was move 2 very senior black teachers here to Wilson from the, quote, formerly colored schools. Now that was tokenism, you bet it was, but it was wonderful tokenism because they were great teachers. I didn't have Mr. Lucas in chemistry, I didn't take chemistry. Friends of mine who did said he was one of the best science teachers they ever had. I had Mrs. Jackson, Mrs. Edna Jackson, for history, and she was marvelous, My family is from the South, and she reminded me so much of my mother and my aunts. And she was just a wonderful teacher, and it was only later, when I was in grad school, when I started reading the Journal of Negro History, that I found her name there on the editorial board. She had been a friend and colleague of Carter Woodson's. I mean, that's the kind of place this was. One other thing I'd like to mention. Among us whiteys, we were probably about a third Jewish, I think. The rest of us, though, were almost entirely Protestants. Very few Catholics. I think most of you know the reason why. Washington has what I call the parallel universe of parochial schools, which go from parish schools, like St. Anne's right over here, all the way through some very Tony prep schools, as we were reminded with Mr. Kavanaugh's, Judge Kavanaugh's hearings. And so we didn't have very many Catholics. Interestingly, though, and I think this is where Wilson may have been different from, say, Bronx Science or some of those other schools. The academic talent, the athletic talent, the social talent was really quite pretty evenly spread between the Jewish kids and the rest of the kids. That again, I think was something wonderful about this place. I mean, that's what Woodrow Wilson High School was. I think that memory should be continued. If his name is so terribly offensive, then certainly go ahead. The earth belongs to the living. I do not think he crossed the line.
My name is John Howard. I graduated from Woodrow Wilson High School in 1972. I've not lived here. In 1989 or 90, I left this area and moved to Northern Virginia, where I live today. I've done a lot of things in the time period since '72, but since 2009, I've been an educator, a teacher, adjunct professor, and the like. I've taught at 3 high schools named for Confederate generals: Robert E. Lee, Jeb Stuart, and Stonewall Jackson, all in Fairfax and Prince William counties. The interesting thing is that a plurality of my students are neither white nor black, and that's the changing times we live in. And for most of them, they have no real stake or clue as to what the significance of this debate is. So the point that someone made earlier about the need, I think you made it, Ms. Keating, about the need to raise, maybe it was others as well, to talk to students, to make this a disciplined part of your curriculum. And I would point to you, Mr. Alston, as a history teacher, one teacher to another, to make that happen. It's obviously a community issue. There is a brand issue, as you mentioned, about the reputation of the name. But at the end of the day, it's a community issue. And I would just simply say that when this community makes this decision, that it do so with eyes wide open. And that's really all I have to say.
Thank you. Just following up on that, and something that Mr. Cooper said, he was talking about the district, but 2 schools in Northern Virginia have changed their name very recently. Jeb Stuart and Washington Lee to Justice and Equality. If we change the name here, I have a couple of suggestions, and one would be to name it after Richard and Mildred Loving. This is a very, I could talk too long tonight. They got married in 1958, okay, in the district. They moved back to their home in Caroline County. They were arrested and kicked out of Virginia, came back to the district after the 1958 marriage. 1967, the Supreme Court invalidated 17 states who said interracial marriage cannot be consummated, and they allowed this marriage. He was a white man, she was African American and Native American. Another person I would like you to consider, if you do, is August Wilson. Maybe we wouldn't have to change. Maybe we wouldn't have to change too much of the letterhead and the signage. Keep in mind Frederick Douglass. One last thing, one thing that really bothers me, I do appreciate what you said about his Woodrow Wilson's accomplishment, but in 1915 he agreed to bring into the White House a movie called The Birth of the Nation. He watched it, he praised it at the end, it extolled the KKK. So, that bothers me.
My name is Richard Pollack, and I'm a reporter. I've lived here in Washington. I did the math here in this room, and I realized this year I've been here for half a century as of this year. I love this city. I also was a co-plaintiff with Hilda Mason, by the way, in a civil rights case, and I love Hilda. But I'm going to talk about why I have reservations about changing the name. I think that when we look at progress, I'm a reporter, and when we look at progress, we notice that progress happens in certain time frames, in certain environments. So what did Wilson do? So Wilson was, first of all, an educator. He was the president of Princeton University. Second, as was mentioned, he had a lot of programs that were the precursors for the New Deal. The basis of the New Deal came from progress that he personally put forward, including, and it may not sound like a lot, but the 8-hour day. Legally, an 8-hour day. That was progress then. Today, we just take it for granted. He did other things that were just really quite incredible. He was a man of peace. He created the League of Nations, which was the precursor for the United Nations, and conservatives opposed it, and it's why it didn't succeed in the U.S. Senate, wasn't confirmed. I'm not sure what the progress of history would have been if the League of Nations had gone forward with the United States behind it, but the truth is, he was a man of peace in his time. He saw the absolute devastation of millions of people dead from World War I. He was there. There were a tremendous number of very progressive things that he did to help our country move forward. Now, I'll just give you one analogy. I have a friend who I know, who is of a very, very, very well-known environmental group in this country. He was a pioneer in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But you know what? He drove a Cadillac. And you know what else? He had a big house that had all sorts of fossil fuels. He was terrible from that point of view of us looking today at what he did. But he was a pioneer in his time. Woodrow Wilson was someone who, and this may not sound big, but he tried to outlaw the lynching trees. If you go to the Eastern Shore, you'll see the lynching trees in the front and the back of every town, where African Americans were lynched for all sorts of things at the whims of white people. Now, that may not have seemed like that was a big thing, but at that time, it was a revolution. Was he a racist? Absolutely. But the things he did to bring out the precursors and the foundations of the New Deal, what he did in trying to go and have world peace, what he did as the only educator, as President of the United States, as the President of Princeton University, as a Governor of New Jersey, as a Democrat in New Jersey. I believe that that's why Woodrow Wilson's name, and I'm not a big fan of Wilson personally, but in his time, in his place, he was progressive, and he advanced it so that we have the liberties and the fruits of those great things today from those small steps that he did. And that's why I think that we ought to judge people in terms of who they were in that time and not by how we judge them today.
Thanks, Mr. Pollock. We're going to hear from other members of the audience.
I've never seen a white person in my life. This is white. I've never seen a darker complected, melanated man the color black. These were names renaming people. The Europeans who came here after 1492 in 1871 were renamed white. Moors, who are the heirs of the land under the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, were renamed black. Black is a Germanic English word that actually means bleach, pale, wan, lack of color. I have some really good news for the students and Mr. Fisher. The true heirs have woken up, and the true heirs have already notified the Corporation of the United States of America, Trump, and they have liened all corporations over $100 million. Now, if this name is not changed, the heirs will name the change, and it works like this. We lien corporations and we make our demands. We lien corporations and we make our demands. Right now, the Corporation of the United States, Trump can't get overseas bankers to bring in money right now because the liens are already under, so they're scrambling. So if the name isn't changed, the true heirs will name the change because we'll lien the corporations here. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Hugo Keating. I'm a Wilson graduate, class of 1961. And I think I speak for everyone until such time as the school's name may change. We're all going to be Wilson graduates, and Wilson's going to be on that certificate, which shows us that we've graduated from high school. Now, currently I also serve on the board of the Woodrow Wilson Alumni Association. And in this role, I've gotten feedback from not only my own classmates, but from a number of other people. And while there isn't a consensus, there is a feeling that, yes, we certainly would not want to deprive today's students from honoring a new person and having such a name at some point perhaps attached to the school. I think the concern is that the process by which it might be done is what we may not like. And Ms. Bollinger, I'm going to quote you because I think one of your statements is the one that the feedback to me would make the most difficult. Continuing to honor Woodrow Wilson is perpetuation of racism. I think that that implicates, 60 years or 70 years of students who are proud of their Wilson graduation and proud of their Wilson roots, to imply that if they continue to say, I'm a graduate of Woodrow Wilson, that they are somehow complicit in racism. I think that's what bothers us. In order to honor a new person, I don't think it's necessary to vilify the older, the former name. So if you don't begin by taking Wilson's name off, but if the starting point is there is a new person or there is a new something we wish to honor, and that this new individual perhaps would replace Wilson, I think that my constituents would be all for a new generation having their own newly named high school.
I'd like to get a quick response from Ms. Bollinger, and then Principal Martin, I'd like to hear from you on, just briefly, on what the actual process would be. How do you change the name of the school? Ms. Bollinger? Let's get a mic there.
Thanks. I guess I'll just say a couple things. Yes, I mean, I do stand by the statement. And I think that it can be difficult sometimes, especially, for people to look at our society and understand that you can say you're against racism, but your actions and what you do and what you enable can say something very different. I think if you look at the state of Virginia right now, you have a lot of elected officials who have done racist things, and that's been tolerated, and it's been enabled. And you have generations of white students growing up thinking that completely unacceptable things are okay. So to me, fostering complacency about racism by not doing anything about the fact that our school is named after someone who is racist, to me perpetuates the racism. And we all have a choice to make, right? We can disavow the values and fight for something better. It doesn't mean that if you have a diploma or if you went here or you teach here that you're somehow, by definition, a racist. I'm not trying to throw things out there just to be provocative and so words lose their meaning. But I do think that we have to, choose to not be complacent, especially now. I mean, we have information. We know about Reno City. We know the scholarship around Wilson. There's not much there to debate on the question of race. The only thing I'll say is that by going on about Wilson's accomplishments, which I know are there and are worthy of debate in a history classroom, what I hear as well is the idea that his racist actions are just less important than some of the other things that he did. And that's the message that I think a lot of students get, and it's not a message that I find acceptable as an educator, especially an educator of students of color and African American students. And I have a responsibility to say that to us, the racism, these practices are a crime, that they are unacceptable, that we don't just kind of say, okay, well, they're all equal, it's good and bad. No. Someone's prejudice, acting on it systematically, several times, regardless of the controversy and different interpretations about birth of a nation, his record, stands. And that's something that, to me, that carries a lot of weight, and it should. It should be the yardstick that we use. It should be one of many yardsticks, but it should be a central yardstick to when we measure the legacy of some of these leaders.
I just want to say that guilt by association is the feeling that some of my constituents are getting, and that's what they find bothersome.
The process going forward in relation to this changing of the name of the school is that the DC History and Justice Collective and the Diversity Task Force has by no means the intention that this will be the last symposium or the last discussion, or that this is just the only thing that we're going to do, and then all of a sudden we're going to start ripping down the names and tearing up our beautiful cloths there, which are very expensive. The process is, of course, much more involved. the very first step would be that the ANC would have to buy into this process and create a resolution. And in order for the ANC to even buy in, that has to be something that the entire community has agreed is something that we want to do, that it has to be a community action. By no means is this a high school principal decision, even a staff member's decision. It's a community decision, and which is why we're having our first of many community meetings. Tim, you want to comment on the process for changing the name?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Principal Martin, and thanks for just quickly.
My name is Jane Sargis, and I am the Wilson parent of 2 grads, Alex Klein in 2000 and Andrew Klein in 2003. I stand here in support of changing the name of Woodrow Wilson High School. Supporting a name change does not mean I support revising or erasing history. Rather, it means that I support understanding and acknowledging the past to make informed decisions in the present. President Wilson may have been a man of his times, but I'm a concerned citizen in these times. We're not far removed from Wilson's legacy of segregation, and we still have much work to do along the lines of racial equity, work that must continue after we are gone. This event tonight is a small footnote in history. In a knowledge-based democracy, we learn from the past and make changes in the future. This is the least we can do. It's time to make that change.
My name is Roderick Hill, just like a lot of people here. I'm a former student here, and basically, I think that the name of the school should be changed. I really don't know. I always feel that just because you do some good, I think the bad that you do outweighs the good that you do. Take, for instance, George Wallace. At the end of his life, he wanted to be forgiven for maybe a few things he did, but the overall bad things that he did outweighed, I think, any good thing he did. Now, I also believe that President Trump, in his 2 years of office, he's done a lot of bad things. So if he decides to do a few good things, I don't think that has any weight. I think the governor of Virginia, right now, I think he should resign. Why? Because of the fact that just because he had blackface, I mean, that negates all the good that he can do. So basically, I feel that Wilson was a man, and I know the gentleman up on the stage said that the birth of the nation, that he didn't know it was coming, but he still showed. And basically, I feel that he was questioned by people around the world when the League of Nations was trying to be formed. What about all the lynchings in the United States? Now, basically, I don't know what he said, but he had to try to play that off. America was going around talking about it was a champion of democracy in the world, yet it allowed its own citizens to be hung from trees, body parts to be cut off, and a lot of harmful things to not just blacks, but Native Americans, Jewish Americans, and many other Americans. So basically, I'm one who feels that the name of the school should be changed, just like the people at Howard University. General Howard was a notorious Native American killer. So they say we should change the name of Howard University. I feel they should change the name of Wilson. Thank you.
I want to just ask, where is the line? I believe, and what we decide to focus on. Washington, Jefferson had slaves. Are we going to rename the monuments? Is there going to be a change petition for that? FDR was not good to Jews during World War II, during the Holocaust. I'm a Jew. Are all FDR buildings going to be changed? Where is the line? Where do you focus on the good? This town is named Washington, D.C. Are we changing the name of this city because he had slaves? So, I mean, this is, this can go on and on and on like this, and I think to just, we have to decide where that line is and what we're going to focus on. I want my daughters to go to a school where they do tolerate a diversity of thought, and teachers are open to having that thought. And I don't believe having that name puts a bad name on this community. Thanks.
You are a curator, you're a historian, and you're someone who works in the Anacostia branch of the Smithsonian. You've been hearing different views of this same patch of land and this set of questions. Where is the line? Historically, where is the line?
I think it's a very difficult
I think it's a very difficult question. Where is the line? The line is where the community thinks it is, I think, in this situation. That's what I would do. I mean, the community have to be, able to come up and say, yes, the majority thinks that it should change, or no, we don't think it should change. Because there are reasons for both things. There are historic reasons to change the name, because he was a racist, there's no question about it. He also did a lot of good things. In my other life, I studied Afro-Brazilians who returned to West Africa in the 19th century. And the Afro-Brazilian community in Togo was very well informed. And right after the First World War, they just took Wilson's word that the colonies should be free, and they went writing letters to the League of Nations, to everybody that they could find in England and so on, to get independence for Togo. So it was all based on Wilson's words. So that's amazing, but does that mean that what he did here in the United States is not considered? No. So I think the community will have to decide this. I wouldn't, leave it for anybody else. The community has to come up with a decision.
But that's a great answer as far as it goes. But when you're talking about a school in a city, what's the boundary of the community? When you say the community ought to decide, is it the households that are within the designated footprint of a districted school? Is it all the households in the city? Is it the extended community of students and alumni? How do you define community for the purpose of having this debate and coming to some common wisdom about it?
Well, I understand that this process is just starting. I think the principal just said that the process is just starting. So that is something to be decided in this, in this process, because, it will be natural. I think eventually there will be a decision. This is the group that should discuss this. These are the boundaries. Is it the students and the teachers, or the community around the school, or the whole city? I don't know. The process is going to determine that. One thing we have to take into account, this is happening all over the United States right now. This is not just happening here. A Pandora box was opened and is not going to be closed again, right? For a long time, I think. Yeah. So, yes, you can come.
I think the students should decide, and the parents should stay out of it. They're learning in the schools. This is their school. Why can't they decide?
Yes, ma'am. You're next.
My name is Maya Wilson, and I'm currently a senior at Wilson, and I came into this. I mean, I think the name should be changed, but I'm not really up in arms about it. It's not the thing that I'm most passionate about, and I'd say that's probably the general consensus of students. People are yeah, probably shouldn't have the name after him, but it seems like a lot of work to go through the whole process of changing the name, and also it's very easy, like Nikki was saying earlier, to just sort of disassociate. I can't remember last time I said I go to Woodrow Wilson High School. I go to Wilson. It's not really you say the name and you even think of the president at all. But after hearing what the panel has to say, I think what has stuck with me most is what Ms. Bollinger said about what it would mean to students to be hey, it might feel like this isn't a big deal, and it might feel like it's easy to disassociate from the president, but it actually is a really important thing to be active about this sort of thing, because what I see in school as the most upsetting and disgusting and disturbing evidence of racism and system of oppressions is just passivity, and specifically white passivity, and students not feeling obligated to step in or do anything or make any sort of active change in their own lives, and sitting in an AP class with 30 white kids and 4 black kids, and all the black kids sit at one table together, and there isn't really any sort of intermingling. And I think that going through the process and making a really active choice to change the name would send a really important message about being active in the things we do and the ways we combat racism. And in response to what you were saying, Mr. Rosenthal, about like, should we change the name of every monument of any person who's ever owned a slave? No, I wouldn't go that far, but I think that because this is a school and this is where we're teaching people how to be active citizens, naming it after a racist is extremely inappropriate. And I also think it's important to add that I don't think that changing the name like takes away the years that the school has been named after Woodrow Wilson. And I think that like he's had his time, we've honored him enough. Yeah, League of Nations, blah blah. But it's time for someone new.
Good evening. My name is Solomon Palmer. I'm a 42-year resident of Washington, D.C., proud parent of 2 young sons who graduated from Woodrow Wilson. And I'm here representing one of my sons who does agree that the name should change. And with that, so what I wanted to also say, just in terms of context for this evening, right now we're looking at the 400th anniversary, the first African enslaved in Jamestown. And also, this is Black History Month. So I've heard some discussion this evening about how do we kind of balance good and evil, what's the right time to do things. And so I wanted to just suggest some thoughts by a man who I believe was man for all seasons, and that was Dr. King, because he dealt with some of these same particular arguments during his tenure as a civil rights leader. And one of the things, young folks, that Dr. King said that spoke volumes about leadership, and I quote, he says, "The measure of a man is not where he stands in time of comfort and convenience, but rather where he stands on challenge and controversies." President Wilson had an opportunity to stand and take a position on an issue that we're still dealing with today in America. In fact, as African American citizens, are we human beings? He had an opportunity to take a position, and unfortunately, he came out on the wrong side of history. Shame on him. Finally, in the context of when is it right to do, or when is it wrong to do, or when should we say, or what should we do, I think, once again, Dr. King had the solution. And I quote, and I leave you with this, young folks, because this is so important. He says, "It's always the right time to do the right thing." Thank you.
Hi, y'all. I'm Will Duggan. I went to Lafayette, DO Middle School and Wilson High School. And I just want to apologize to Mr. Fisher because I'm just learning now about the history of every single school I went to and how it was built on this really troubled path. And I'm disappointed in DC Public Schools for not properly teaching me about the history of the land that I was being educated on. And about the comment about academic merit and what Wilson stands for, you know, I think that's a huge disappointment, and I strongly believe that we need to correct that. Second thought is just, when I went to Wilson, graduated 2007, you know, I think white folks were in the 20% demographic, and the majority of the population were African Americans. And so maybe there was some poetic justice in the fact that this school that was named after this famed racist was now populated by mostly African American students that were getting a pretty good education at this school in a segregated neighborhood for the most part. And I think that's changing nowadays as we're seeing DC go through its process of gentrification. And so what might have been funny or a joke back in the day is now becoming a little bit too real. And so I think we need to correct that path. And again, I just want to apologize, Mr. Fisher.
I'm Joan Churchill. I was born in Washington, D.C., member of the Woodrow Wilson class of 1958. So I don't remember you, but we obviously overlapped. We didn't really call it Woodrow Wilson much, I don't think, and I never thought of myself as somehow embodying Woodrow Wilson as a student here. I oppose the name change. I think our country has been too focused on well, we're calling it cosmetic things. Changing the name is not going to bring back a farming community to the Reno area. It's not going to restore farms in where Lafayette is built. And changing the name isn't going to move the school. I feel it's so, I believe very strongly in continuity. I've lived in the same house, which is actually closer to Wilson High School than when I was a student here. I've lived in it over 40 years. I think it's 45 now. I believe in the importance of continuity. I believe in school spirit. And I have tremendous school spirit for Wilson High School. Changing the name would demolish that spirit enormously. And I just think it's not the right thing to do. My mother was the principal of a school here in Washington, D.C. She actually created the school in a way, the Sharp House School, which was for the children that were handicapped. I'm very sad to say that school has closed, and it was much newer than Wilson. We don't need to judge Wilson, the president. We have a school that stands for excellence, and we want to continue the tradition and the spirit that goes with the spirit of excellence. Thank you.
I feel like when people say like it's not like changing school name is like not enough, or it's like a cosmetic example, or just like that's demolishing something. That's an example of what I refer to as white passivity. That's sort of like white complacency in the idea that like, oh, like, it happened a long time ago, here's good things that he did, so why change the name? And that's just not an example, like, for people of color, that isn't the same. And I think that when white people are complacent in anything like naming a school after a racist person, or even just like participating in acts of ignorance or racism, that is complicit. That's complicit in racism. And saying that it's not worth it to change the name just because, it may feel like you're losing some school spirit. Me at my school, I'm not losing any school spirit. In fact, I'm enacting school spirit by like saying that I want to passionately change the name. This is school spirit to me.
I gave away my age by saying the year I graduated high school. So I take a much longer view than you. I think the feelings of alums are very important. Just saying that the students should have a say, you'd be changing the school's name very often, and I think that would demolish a lot of the school spirit.
Matthew Fruman, parent of 3 Wilson grads. A danger of going late is many people have made the points already, and gosh, I wish I didn't have to follow you, Ayomi. So, I mean, where's the line is a tricky thing. And the fact that Wilson is a multifaceted character is a reality. But I hearken to what Mr. Flanagan said about, in this place, in this time, is it appropriate to have the school named after Woodrow Wilson, given what we're all trying to come to grips with in this city and in our country about the legacy of racism. In a certain sense, we're in an increased period of education on this question. More of us are thinking about it than have been before. The point that was made by one of the kids who went to school with my kids about the change at Wilson, where it was once a very dominantly African-American school, and that dynamic is changing, and we're losing, or we risk losing diversity, in a way makes this issue even more urgent, because we live in a segregated city, and as the school runs the risk of becoming less diverse, there's an urgency around these questions. I don't think, the idea of guilt by association for alumni, I don't see that. I mean, we all have a guilt about where our country is, but not a special guilt because you graduated from a school with a name. And the descriptions about how wonderful Wilson was, say back in the 50s, it's an extraordinary place. I mean, the Wilson that my children went to was a special place. The Wilson that you went to is a special place. The Wilson that you're at is a special place. None of it has anything to do with the name on the school. Everything. goes to the people in the school, the students, the teachers, the experience that we can create. And so if it's a question of, in this moment in time, in this place, where we have the legacy of segregation, where we have the legacy of displacement, should we honor a person who played such a central role in pushing down the prospects of the African American population in the District of Columbia? We can do better than that, and we do not denigrate in any way anyone's previous experience here by doing it. We celebrate what's made the school great.
Very happy to hear this panel, and in particular to hear some of the DC history. I was saying earlier that in 1977, DC Public Schools, actually at Alice Deal, piloted a DC history class, which was really a highlight of those 3 years, and I'm glad to see that that's now part of the curriculum here at Wilson. Many people have made the points I think that I would make. I'm proud to have gone to this school. I think the school that was described in the 50s is quite different from what I experienced in the 80s and what I think the school is now. And that's the school I think we remain proud of under any name. I don't think it's appropriate to continue to name, with what we know now and the conversations we are having now, to continue to have this school named after someone who was an architect of white supremacy in this city and beyond. And so I support the community in continuing this exploration. I'm particularly interested, though, in comments that Principal Martin made at the beginning and the current students and faculty have made, because as we think about who gets to make this decision and who decides and who is the community that decides, I feel very strongly that the weight should fall to the current community, the students who are here now, the faculty teaching here now. And I hope that as we continue this discussion, we'll see in the room more community members who are from now, and not just me from, I fear it, maybe 35 years ago. But kudos to the group for bringing this together and for all of you for participating on the panel. Thank you.
My two sons went to Wilson. My older son had Miss Bollinger. And I have to say that I agree that it's time to change the name. I do want to throw out a few other names in the interest of maybe, saving money on some of the changing of the, I agree that August Wilson would be a good choice. I have a couple of others. Teddy Wilson, who was a great jazz pianist, integrated the Benny Goodman Band. Russell Wilson would also be a good choice. And my personal favorite, because I know my sons often worked late into the night on their homework assignments and on the Wilson Players and the Wilson Crew, and often until the midnight hour, I would recommend Wilson Pickett.
Before we close for the night, I want to find out if any of the panelists have anything that is left unsaid that you really think has to be said before we close this down. And let's get a microphone to you if you feel that way. If not, we'll say goodnight. Go ahead, Ms. Bollinger.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who commented, and I appreciate some of our messages and our ideas being received, and I want to just underscore that I'm making my comments out of respect and love for this community, and I hope that I think we all share in that, and I hope people know that. The second thing, and is just what Chris said, is I agree with you that our work, we have so much work to do to create a truly equitable learning environment. I think that a lot of people in our school are super serious about having that discussion. Black Lives Matter at School Week was last week. There are so many proposals about how to carry the conversation forward, and I'm looking forward to being part of those discussions, and I think taking that seriously is part of this, because we don't want just cosmetic changes, we want real, meaningful change.
Thanks a lot for coming, and thanks to all our panelists.